The story of Anne Frank is among the most well-known of the 6 million Jews who died in the Holocaust. Her diary is the first encounter many people have with the history of Nazi Germany's attempt to murder all the Jews of Europe during World War II. Anne Frank and her family spent 2 years hiding in a secret attic apartment behind the office of a family-owned business in Amsterdam. Anne Frank was a German girl and Jewish victim of the Holocaust, who is famous for keeping a diary of her experiences. Anne and her family went into hiding for 2 years to avoid Nazi persecution. Her documentation of this time is now published in the Diary of a Young Girl. She was born Anneliese Marie Frank on June 12, 1929, in Frankfurt, Germany. Her parents were Otto and Edith Frank. For the first 5 years of her life, Anne lived with her parents and older sister, Margot, in an apartment on the outskirts of Frankfurt. After the Nazis seized power in 1933, Otto Frank fled to Amsterdam in the Netherlands, where he had business connections. The rest of the Frank family soon followed, with Anne being the last of the family to arrive in February 1934 after staying with her grandparents in Aachen. After years of enduring anti-Semitism in Germany, the Franks were relieved to once again enjoy freedom in their new hometown of Amsterdam. Frank began attending Amsterdam's 6th Montessori school in 1934, and throughout the rest of the 1930s, she lived a relatively happy and normal childhood. Frank had many friends, Dutch and German, Jewish and Christian, and she was a bright and inquisitive student. Although Frank and her family enjoyed the safety of the Netherlands, this all changed when Nazi Germany invaded Poland in 1939 and the Second World War began. Less than a year later, Nazis invaded the Netherlands. The Dutch army quickly surrendered, and the Nazi army began enforcing new laws restricting Jewish mobility. Jewish people were no longer allowed to visit non-Jewish places of business and Jewish children had to attend separate Jewish schools. Soon after, all Jews had to start wearing a Star of David on their clothes for identification. By the summer of 1942, Jewish people in the Netherlands started receiving calls and notices to report to work at Camp Westerbork, near the German border. Many of them were unaware that Nazi officials were then transporting them to the 2 major Jewish killing centers. On July 5, 1942, Frank's sister Margot received a call to report to a labor camp in Germany. Suspicious of the call and fearing for their lives, the Franks decided to go into hiding instead of reporting to the camp. The very next day, the entire family began hiding in the annex behind the office the family owned at Prinsengracht 263. The family soon welcomed 4 Dutch Jews into the secret attic apartment to escape persecution. The group hid in the secret annex for 2 years, while their friends smuggled food and clothing to help keep them safe. Right before they went into hiding, Frank received a diary for her 13th birthday. While she was in hiding with her family, she began recording her experiences, thoughts, and feelings in her diary. She also wrote short stories and started a novel about her life. On August 4, 1944, a German secret police officer accompanied by 4 Dutch Nazis stormed into the secret annex, arresting everyone that was hiding there including Frank and her family. They had been betrayed by an anonymous tip, and the identity of their betrayer remains unknown to this day. The residents of the secret annex were shipped off to Camp Westerbork, a concentration camp in the northeastern Netherlands. They arrived by a passenger train on August 8, 1944. In the middle of the night on September 3, 1944, they were transferred to the Auschwitz concentration camp in Poland. Upon arriving at Auschwitz, the men and women were separated. This was the last time that Otto ever saw his wife or daughters. After several months of hard labor hauling heavy stones and grass mats, Frank and Margot were again transferred. They arrived at the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in Germany during the winter, where food was scarce, sanitation was awful and disease ran rampant. Their mother was not allowed to go with them. Edith fell ill and died at Auschwitz shortly after arriving at the camp, on January 6, 1945. Frank and her sister Margot both came down with typhus in the early spring of 1945. They died within a day of each other in March 1945, only a few weeks before British soldiers liberated the German Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, where they were interned. Frank was just 15 years old at the time of her death, one of more than 1 million Jewish children who died in the Holocaust. At the end of the war, Frank's father Otto, the sole survivor of the concentration camps, returned home to Amsterdam, searching desperately for news of his family. On July 18, 1945, he met two sisters who had been with Frank and Margot at Bergen-Belsen and delivered the tragic news of their deaths. He found Frank's diary, which had been saved by Miep Gies. He eventually gathered the strength to read it. There are many important messages in this book, but the most important message is that all people have the right to live in freedom. Anne's story shows us that just because people may be a different religion or race, doesn't mean that they should be treated differently. The terrible treatment of Jewish people during the war has shown this. Her diary shows us things that people don't think about now, for example how every day the people in hiding worried about maybe being found and punished. The diary, which has been translated into more than 65 languages, is the most widely read diary of the Holocaust, and Anne is probably the best known of Holocaust victims.